On October 21st, 1978, a young pilot took off on what should have been a very routine flight over the waters of South Australia, but he never came back. Before disappearing, he radioed air traffic control with a very chilling report that something was following him, something he couldn't identify. Minutes later, the transmission ended and Frederick Valentich vanished without a trace. There was no wreckage, no body, and no answers. Nearly 50 years later, people are still arguing about what actually happened that night. Welcome back to the Ninth File. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries, strange history, government secrets, cryptids, cults, and those cases that just leave investigators staring at the wall at 3 a.m. wondering what they missed, I've got good news for you because you're in the right place. So before we dive into one of aviation's strangest disappearances, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel because every subscription helps my channel grow. It helps more people discover these stories, and most importantly, it gives me a perfectly reasonable excuse to spend an unhealthy amount of time researching mysteries that should probably have been solved decades ago. Now, before we do anything else, let me know in the comments, what do you think happened to Frederick Valentich? Because the deeper investigators dug into his disappearance, the stranger it became. Before we get into the mysterious disappearance, we need to talk about the man at the center of the story because every mystery starts with a person. And Frederick Valentich wasn't some grizzled veteran pilot with 30 years of experience and enough flight hours to circle the globe several times. He was 20 years old. 20. The age where most of us are making questionable decisions involving energy drinks, bad relationships, and absolutely no sleep. Frederick, however, he had chosen a slightly more ambitious hobby, flying airplanes. Born in 1958 in Australia, Frederick had been fascinated by aviation from a very early age. Friends and family described him as a polite, quiet, respectful man who was deeply interested in becoming a professional pilot. Flying was not just something he enjoyed, it was a passion. It was the plan, the dream, the career, the thing he wanted to spend the rest of his life doing. And by all accounts, he took that very seriously. Now, at the time of his disappearance, he had held a private pilot's license and had accumulated around 150 hours of flying experience. Now, to someone who's never flown, 150 hours sounds really impressive, and it definitely is, but in aviation terms, that's kind of the equivalent of a teenager getting their driver's license and immediately deciding they're ready for Formula One. Sure, Frederick was competent, he was trained, but he was still learning, still building experience, and still making mistakes, and unfortunately, there had been a few of those. Aviation records show that Frederick had failed portions of commercial pilot examinations more than once. He had struggled with some of the written testing that was required in order to advance his career. There was also reports that he had received warnings for flying into restricted airspace, which really is just aviation's version of accidentally driving onto a military base and then acting all surprised when people start asking questions. It was nothing catastrophic. It was nothing that suggested he was reckless, but it was enough that investigators would later pay some pretty close attention to that. Because when a pilot disappears under weird circumstances, every previous mistake suddenly gets dragged back into the spotlight. And then there was another detail that would become impossible to ignore. Frederick had a deep fascination with UFOs. Now, before the skeptics start throwing folding chairs, that does not mean that Frederick was running around Australia's countryside wearing a tinfoil hat and waiting for little green men to beam him up into space. In the 1970s, UFOs were everywhere. They had reached maximum popularity at that point. They were in books, they were in television specials, in movies, in newspaper stories. People were talking about them constantly, and Frederick found himself very interested in the subject. Friends later reported that he had discussed UFOs on multiple occasions, and he believed that unexplained aerial phenomena was a real thing. Now, was that unusual? No, not really. But after his disappearance, it became one of the most talked about details in the entire case. Because if a pilot who already believes UFOs might exist reports seeing something strange, well, some people will immediately see it as confirmation of them existing, while others will immediately see it as bias. And that's kind of the debate that has continued for almost 50 years. The truth is that Frederick Valentich was neither an aviation genius nor an incompetent fool. He was something much more common. A young pilot that was chasing a dream. He was talented enough to fly, inexperienced enough to make mistakes, confident enough to cross the Bass Strait alone, and perhaps unaware that he was about to become one of Australia's most famous missing persons. By October 21st of 1978, Frederick was focused on building flight experience and moving closer and closer to his professional aviation goal. But instead, he was about to take a flight that would make him famous for an entirely different reason. Now, the strangest part about Frederick's disappearance is that nothing about his flight initially raised any alarms. There was no emergency, no mechanical failure, no signs that anything was wrong. In fact, when Frederick took off that evening, it looked like one of the most ordinary flights of his life. On October 21st, 1978, Frederick arrived at Melbourne's Moorabbin Airport, and he prepared for an evening trip to King Island, which was a small island located in the Bass Strait between mainland Australia and Tasmania. The flight should have taken just a little bit over an hour, so it was nothing strenuous, nothing unusual, and nothing particularly dangerous, just a young pilot building experience and logging more flight time. At least, that's what it looked like on paper. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Bass Strait, imagine Mother Nature looked at an ordinary stretch of ocean and said, "You know what that needs? More ways to kill people." See, the Bass Strait has earned a reputation over the years for rough seas, rapidly changing weather, and a long history of shipwrecks and aircraft accidents. It's beautiful. It's scenic. It's also the kind of place where search and rescue crews have made entire careers. Still, conditions that evening were considered very good. Visibility was acceptable, weather was not a concern, there were no storms lurking on the horizon, no reports suggesting pilots should avoid the area. As far as anyone knew, this was a perfectly ordinary night to fly. Frederick climbed into his aircraft, a single-engine Cessna 182 Skylane. Not a giant airliner, not a military jet, just a reliable little workhorse of general aviation. It's basically the Toyota Corolla of the sky. It's the kind of aircraft that carried thousands of pilots safely across countless miles. He completed his pre-flight checks, he started the engine, and he took off into the evening sky. For nearly an hour, everything appeared absolutely normal. Air traffic controllers were not concerned at all. Other pilots had not reported anything unusual in the area. Nothing suggested that this flight would become international news. And then, at approximately 7:06 p.m., Frederick radioed Melbourne Flight Service with a question. It was not a distress call. It was not a mayday. Just a question, a simple question that would become one of the most famous radio transmissions in aviation history. Frederick wanted to know if there was any known aircraft flying below 5,000 feet in his immediate area. The controller checked, and the answer came back quite quickly. No, there wasn't. And that's the exact moment that this story stops being a routine flight and starts becoming a mystery. What follows is not a campfire story. It's not a rumor. It's not something somebody's cousin swears they heard. These were actual radio communications. They were recorded, they were documented, and they were preserved. Valentich had asked if there was any other aircraft in the area, and he was told no. The answer should have ended the conversation, but instead, it raised an even bigger question because Frederick wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking because he could see something. And that's when things get weird. After hearing that there were no aircraft in the area, Frederick radioed back and explained that there appeared to be a large object approaching his plane. Now, at first, nobody panicked. Why would they? Misidentifications happened all the time. Pilots mistake lights for stars, stars for aircrafts, aircraft for planets, planets for UFOs. And every once in a while, somebody mistakes Venus for the beginning of an alien invasion. Air traffic controllers were used to sorting through confusion. But as Frederick continued describing what he was seeing, things became a little bit harder to explain. According to his transmissions, the object wasn't simply passing by him. It appeared to be moving around him. One moment it was approaching, and the next it was above him, then it seemed to be circling. Imagine being the controller on the other end of that radio. You can't see what Frederick sees. You can't look out a window. You can't point to a radar screen and identify the target. All you have is a young pilot's voice and a growing sense that something just isn't right. Frederick described the object as having several bright lights. He said it appeared metallic, and at one point, he reported a green light, not a flashing navigation light like you would expect on a conventional aircraft, a bright green light. And then his descriptions became even stranger. The object seemed to be moving at an incredible speed, not in a straight line, not in a normal flight path. It appeared to be darting around him, changing position, almost playing a game of aerial cat and mouse. Now, before we get too deep into X-Files territory, it is important to remember something. Everything we're hearing is coming from one person, one pilot who is flying alone at night over open water. And that fact will become extremely important later on. But in that moment, Frederick still sounded very calm. Concerned, yes. Confused, absolutely. But not hysterical, not screaming, not sounding like someone in the middle of a panic attack. He sounded like a pilot trying to figure out what it was he was looking at. And then came one of the most famous exchanges in the entire case. Frederick reported that the object appeared to be orbiting his aircraft. Orbiting. Think about that for a second. Aircraft pass by each other. They overtake each other. They cross paths. They don't usually circle around another airplane like a curious shark investigating a floating object in the water. And the longer the conversation continued, the more unsettled that Frederick seemed to become, because whatever he was seeing was not behaving the way he thought an aircraft should behave. Then he made a statement that would echo through decades of UFO documentaries, conspiracy forums, and late-night radio shows. A statement that transformed this from a simple missing persons case into one of the most famous aviation mysteries of all time. Frederick paused. He looked at whatever it was that was moving around his aircraft, and he said, "It's not an aircraft." And suddenly, everyone listening was left with the same question. If it wasn't an aircraft, what was it? Frederick had gone from "what is that" to "I really don't like whatever that is." And honestly, fair, because according to his radio transmissions, the object was not leaving. It wasn't flying away. It wasn't doing the polite aviation thing where two aircraft acknowledge each other and continue on with their day. Instead, it seemed determined to stay right where Frederick was. And the longer the conversation continued, the stranger his descriptions became. He reported that the object was now above him, then beside him, then apparently circling him. Imagine being Frederick for just a second. You're alone. It's very dark. You're flying over the open ocean. Air traffic control is telling you that there are no known aircraft in the area, but yet something is moving around outside of your plane like it's trying to figure out whether you're edible. Not exactly a relaxing evening flight. As controllers listened, Frederick continued trying to describe what it was he was seeing. At one point, he reported that the object appeared elongated. It seemed to have a shiny metallic surface, and there was still that green light coming from it. Then he said that the object was still orbiting his aircraft, which is simply just not a word that pilots typically use unless something very unusual is happening, or unless they're accidentally orbiting something themselves. Remember that detail because we're going to come back to it later. Then the tone of the conversation changed. Up until this point, Frederick had sounded quite puzzled and confused. Now he was starting to sound concerned, like really concerned, because suddenly there was another problem. His engine. Frederick reported that the engine was running rough, and for pilots, that's the aviation equivalent of hearing your surgeon say, "Well, that's not supposed to be there." Nobody likes that sentence, especially when you're thousands of feet above dark water. The controller immediately tried gathering more information, but Frederick's responses were becoming shorter. They were more fragmented. You can almost hear him dividing his attention between flying the airplane and trying to understand whatever it was that was happening outside. And then came the final moments. Frederick reported that the mysterious object was once again above him. He attempted to continue to describe it, but the transmission started to break up. And then, silence. Well, not quite silence. What came next is one of the most chilling details in the whole case. For roughly 17 seconds, the radio transmitted a strange metallic sound. Not a voice, not a mayday, not an engine, just an eerie, scraping, grinding noise. To this day, no one can agree on what caused that sound. Investigators have argued about it endlessly, UFO researchers have analyzed it to death, audio experts have picked it apart, and no one has produced an explanation that satisfies everyone. And then the transmission simply ended. There was no distress call, no crash report, no final words, just nothing. One moment, Frederick was talking to air traffic control, and the next, he was simply gone. And somewhere over the dark waters of the Bass Strait, one of Australia's most enduring mysteries had just begun. The moment Frederick's radio transmission ended, the clock began ticking. In aviation, that's really never a good sign. Planes just simply don't vanish out of thin air. At least, they're not supposed to. If a pilot crashes, investigators are usually able to find something, be it wreckage, fuel, a life vest, a seat cushion, a single piece of twisted metal floating in the water, something, anything. But the Bass Strait had other plans. As concern grew, authorities launched a search operation covering thousands of square miles of ocean. Aircraft scanned from above, boats searched from below, rescue crews combed through the area where Frederick was believed to have disappeared. Everyone expected the same thing. Not a rescue. At this point, that was becoming increasingly unlikely. What they really expected was evidence, some clue that would tell investigators what had happened during those final moments. Instead, they found absolutely nothing. No oil slick, no debris field, no floating wreckage, no sign of Frederick, no sign of the plane, just nothing. And that's where the story starts to become really frustrating because investigators can solve a lot with plane wreckage. I mean, a lot. An aircraft is basically a flying confession note. If an engine fails, the investigators can usually tell. If a wing breaks apart, investigators can usually tell. If the pilot loses control, investigators can often piece together what had happened. The problem is, to do any of that, they need the aircraft, and in this case, the aircraft never showed up. Now, to be fair, the Bass Strait is not exactly eager to help investigators. The waters are very deep, the currents are strong, the weather can change rapidly, and this stretch of ocean had already gained a reputation for swallowing ships, aircraft, and occasionally people's optimism. Now, it's worth taking a quick detour to talk about the Bass Strait itself, because if there was ever a body of water that seemed determined to build a reputation, this area is going to be it. Separating mainland Australia from Tasmania, the Bass Strait has been both a vital shipping route and a graveyard for the unlucky ever since Europeans first began navigating it in the late 1700s. The problem really amounts to geography. The strait is relatively shallow compared to the open ocean, which means the waves there don't just roll through peacefully. They collide with things like powerful currents, changing weather systems, and underwater terrain that can turn rough seas into an absolute nightmare. Over the centuries, hundreds of ships have been lost in these waters. Sailors gave parts of the region names like Shipwreck Coast, which is exactly the sort of name that makes you reconsider your travel plans. Aircraft have not fared much better. The Bass Strait has been the site of numerous aviation accidents, disappearances, and search operations over the years, earning a reputation among pilots as a place that just demands respect. Now, to be clear, the Bass Strait isn't some supernatural Bermuda Triangle lurking off Australia's coast. Most accidents here can be explained by things like weather, navigation errors, mechanical failures, or just simply bad luck. But when something disappears into the Bass Strait, finding it can be a little challenging. The ocean is vast, the currents are strong, and the sea has a habit of keeping its secrets. So the fact that no wreckage was found is not immediately proof that something supernatural happened, but it is unusual, very unusual, especially considering the amount of attention that this case received. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and still not one single piece surfaced. The search was eventually called off, and officially, Frederick and his aircraft were listed as missing. Missing. Not recovered, not explained, just missing, which is one of the most unsettling words in an investigation because missing means the story never really ends. There's no final chapter, no definitive answer, just empty space where an explanation should be. History took another strange turn. In 1983, a piece of engine cowl flap washed ashore, and investigators examined it and found that it was in fact consistent with a Cessna 182, the same type of aircraft that Frederick had been flying. Now, before we cue the dramatic UFO music, there was a bit of a problem. The part could not be conclusively linked to Frederick's plane. It was suggestive, and it was interesting. It was potentially important, but it was not definitive. In other words, it was the investigative equivalent of finding a single puzzle piece and realizing that the other 999 pieces are still missing. So investigators were left exactly where they started. A young pilot had vanished, his plane had vanished, and the search had found nothing. The only people who seemed confident about what had happened were the people who had already made up their minds. The skeptics blamed pilot error, the believers pointed to the radio transmissions, and everyone else was stuck in the uncomfortable middle space because the truth was, and still is, that nobody knows exactly what happened to Frederick after the final transmission. And when there are no answers, theories have a way of multiplying faster than rabbits with a caffeine addiction. One question that often comes up is whether anyone else had seen similar objects in the Bass Strait before Frederick's disappearance. And the answer is sort of. See, there's not a documented history of pilots reporting metallic objects circling their aircraft over the Bass Strait. If there had been, investigators probably would have been all over that. But after Frederick vanished, reports began pouring in from people along the coast who claimed that they had seen some unusual lights in the sky the same night. Some even described strange green lights. Others reported objects moving erratically, and a few believed that they had witnessed something genuinely unexplained. Sounds interesting, right? But here's the problem. Many of those reports arrived only after news of Frederick's disappearance had become public. And that's where investigators run into one of the oldest problems in any mystery. Once people know what they're looking for, they start finding it everywhere. Did those witnesses see the same thing Frederick saw? Maybe. I don't know for sure. Did they see just ordinary aircraft, stars, meteors, or atmospheric effects and connect them to the story that's already dominating the headlines? That's a high probability. What makes Frederick's case unusual isn't that dozens of pilots were reporting metallic craft over the Bass Strait. It's that only one pilot reported it, and then he promptly disappeared. Now, while there aren't other instances of pilots in the area who have seen metallic objects orbiting their planes, Frederick wasn't the first person to disappear in or around that area. Long before his flight, the region already had quite a reputation for swallowing both ships and aircraft. In 1982, pioneering aviators John Moncrief and George Hood vanished while attempting a flight across the Tasmanian Sea. Radio messages were received for hours, but neither the men nor their aircraft were ever found. And then came one of Australia's greatest aviation mysteries. In 1931, an airliner called the Southern Cloud disappeared during a routine flight between Sydney and Melbourne with 8 people aboard. Massive searches found absolutely nothing. The aircraft had effectively just vanished into thin air. That is, until it was discovered 27 years later, when a worker stumbled across the wreckage deep in the mountains. During World War II, numerous military aircraft were also lost in and around the Bass Strait region, often due to rapidly changing weather, navigation difficulties, and the unforgiving conditions pilots faced over open waters. Now, none of these cases involved UFOs. None involved mysterious green lights, and none prove anything supernatural was happening in the Bass Strait. But they do remind us of one very uncomfortable reality. When people disappear in this part of the world, finding them is not always guaranteed. Sometimes the ocean gives answers, but sometimes it keeps them. It didn't take long for people to start connecting the dots. Actually, scratch that. Some people didn't just connect the dots, they grabbed a marker and started drawing entirely new dots, because almost immediately after Frederick Valentich disappeared, one theory shot to the top of the list: aliens. Or, at the very least, a UFO. And honestly, you can see why. Let's look at the facts from the perspective of someone who believes Frederick encountered something genuinely unexplained. The pilot reports a strange object. The object appears to maneuver around his aircraft. Air traffic control just simply cannot identify any known aircraft in the area. Frederick describes bright lights and a metallic appearance. He specifically states it's not an aircraft. His engine reportedly begins running rough, a strange metallic sound is heard over the radio, and then both the pilot and the airplane vanish. If you were using these facts to try to write a UFO movie, you'd probably get rejected for making it too obvious. The case seemed tailor-made for UFO researchers, and they quickly took notice. Over the years, countless investigators, authors, and UFO enthusiasts have pointed to Frederick's radio transmissions as some of the most compelling evidence in any aviation-related UFO case. Unlike many sightings, this wasn't simply somebody claiming that they saw strange lights 20 years ago while walking their dog. The transmission was recorded. You can actually hear Frederick's voice. You can hear the confusion, the concern, and in the end, a bit of fear. And that's the part that keeps the case alive. Because no matter what theory you believe, Frederick genuinely thought he was looking at something. The debate is really over what that something actually was. Then there were the witness reports. After news of the disappearance spread, several people came forward claiming they had seen unusual lights in the sky that evening. Some even described bright green lights. Others reported strange aerial movements, and one witness even claimed to have seen an object moving erratically near the area where Frederick disappeared. To UFO believers, these reports seemed to really support Frederick's account. Maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe other people had seen the same thing. And then there's the mystery that fuels almost every conspiracy theory on Earth. The missing evidence, or more accurately, the lack of evidence. There's no wreckage, no confirmed debris field, no body, no definitive explanation. The ocean just simply swallowed the answer. And whenever that happens, people naturally start asking bigger and bigger questions. Because if Frederick crashed, where's the airplane? If the object was another aircraft, why was it never identified? If he became disoriented, why did his description sound so specific? Those questions have kept the UFO theory alive for almost 50 years, but perhaps the most compelling argument believers make isn't about the object itself. It's about Frederick's voice. If you listen to the recordings, one thing becomes absolutely clear. He doesn't sound like someone who's telling a ghost story. He sounds like a pilot who's trying to understand a situation that makes absolutely no sense. And for many people, that's the detail they simply can't get past. Because whatever happened that night, Frederick sounded convinced that something was there. The problem is that being convinced something is there doesn't necessarily mean that something actually is there. And that's where things get complicated. Now, look, before anyone accuses me of being secretly employed by big anti-alien groups, let me be very clear. I honestly don't even know where I stand on the whole "are aliens real" debate. The universe is ridiculously big. It's bigger than our brains are really equipped to understand. So the idea that we're the only intelligent life form out there seems a little bit arrogant. Now, that said, the more government agencies release classified UFO files, the less convinced I become that they're hiding little green men. At this point, every time a new batch of documents gets released, I feel like I'm watching a magician yell, "Look over there," while quietly walking off with my wallet. Maybe aliens exist, maybe they don't. Maybe they're out there crossing the galaxy to study humanity. And if they are, I would like to formally apologize on behalf of the species for whatever social media platform they looked at first. Either way, whether you believe Frederick encountered something extraordinary or not, we still have to explain what happened in the cockpit that night. And here's the thing. While the UFO theory is undoubtedly the most famous explanation, it's far from being the only one. In fact, the explanation favored by most aviation investigators is far less exciting, and it may even be more terrifying, because it suggests the greatest threat that Frederick faced that night wasn't something outside of the aircraft. It was the aircraft itself, and perhaps even his own senses. Now, let's talk about the explanation that is most favored by the aviation investigators. And fair warning, it is considerably less fun than aliens, but it's far more disturbing in my opinion, because this theory suggests that the thing Frederick was fighting that night was not a UFO. It was his own brain. One of the cruelest realities of aviation is that your senses are often liars. Not all the time, just often enough to get people killed on occasion. As human beings, we trust what we see. We trust what we feel. If you feel like you're turning, you're probably turning. If you feel like you're climbing, you're probably climbing. And on the ground, that is usually true. But in an airplane, not so much. And at night, over open water, the human brain can become spectacularly bad at its one job. Imagine you're flying over the Bass Strait. Below you is darkness. Above you is darkness. Around you is more darkness. The horizon has disappeared. The ocean seems to disappear, and the sky blends into the sea. Suddenly, your eyes lose the visual references that they depend on to tell you what's up, what's down, and what's level. That's when things get dangerous. If your instruments say one thing and your body says another, your body will often swear the instruments are wrong, and your body is usually the one that's lying. Pilots have a name for this: spatial disorientation. It's one of the deadliest killers in the aviation industry, not because it's rare, but because it is so common, and because even experienced pilots fall victim to it. The military trains for it, airlines train for it, private pilots are warned about it repeatedly because once it starts, it can become very difficult to recognize it. A pilot can be descending while feeling that they are perfectly level. They can be turning while feeling like they're going straight, losing control while believing everything is fine, which brings us back to Frederick. Investigators noted that he was flying at night, over open water, with limited experience, in conditions that are practically custom built for spatial disorientation. Then there's that word he used, orbiting. Remember that? I told you we'd come back to it. The mysterious object appeared to be orbiting his aircraft, and at first glance, that sounds truly bizarre, but some investigators proposed something even more fascinating. What if the object wasn't orbiting Frederick? What if Frederick was orbiting the object? Imagine a bright planet, a star, even Venus, something fixed in the sky in the distance. If Frederick unknowingly entered a gradual banking turn, the light could appear to move around him while it was actually him that was moving. From his perspective, the object would seem to be alive. It would seem to be following him, circling him, changing positions. But in reality, he was trapped in a slow turn without even realizing it. And if that turn continued, it could easily become something pilots dread: a graveyard spiral. Now, despite sounding like a heavy metal album from the 80s, a graveyard spiral is a very real thing, and it is very deadly. A pilot enters a turn. The brain stops detecting that you're turning. The aircraft slowly starts losing altitude. The pilot notices the descent and pulls back on the controls, but instead of leveling out, the aircraft tightens the turn. Altitude begins dropping very fast. The pilot pulls harder, the spiral gets worse, and eventually the airplane meets the ground, or in Frederick's case, the ocean, at a very high speed. A truly horrifying part, though, many pilots never realize what's happening until the final moment. To them, everything feels normal until suddenly it isn't. Investigators also pointed to Frederick's aviation record. Remember, he wasn't an airline captain with decades of experience. He had around 150 flight hours. He had failed portions of the commercial examinations. He had previously made navigation mistakes. None of this proves that he became disoriented, but it does mean that he fit the profile of someone who easily could. Then there's that engine problem, he reported. He said his engine was running rough. UFO believers often point to this as evidence that something was interfering with the aircraft, but investigators see something a little bit different. A pilot entering a spiral maneuver can experience changes in engine sound, the power settings, the airflow, and the vibration, and it all may seem a little bit unusual, especially when they're already under a lot of stress. And stress changes everything. When people become frightened, they don't just make mistakes. They start interpreting information differently. Every unusual sound becomes very significant. Every light becomes suspicious. Every uncertainty becomes a threat. Now, does this theory explain every single detail? No, not perfectly. It doesn't explain why Frederick seems so convinced. It doesn't explain every eyewitness report, and it certainly does not satisfy people who believe something extraordinary happened. But let me hit you with some uncomfortable truth. It doesn't have to explain every detail. It only has to explain enough of them. Because unlike the UFO theory, we know spatial disorientation is real. It exists. We have proof. We know it has killed many pilots before, and we know it has produced accidents that seem almost impossible when viewed from the ground. In fact, aviation history is filled with experienced pilots who became victims of the exact same phenomenon. The difference is that most of those accidents left wreckages. Frederick's didn't. And that's why this case remains stuck between two worlds. One explanation is extraordinary, the other is ordinary, yet neither has managed to close the file all the way. And nearly 50 years later, we're still arguing about what Frederick saw that night, if he saw anything at all. By now, we've covered the two heavyweight contender theories. On one side, you have the UFO theory, and then on the other, pilot disorientation and an accidental crash. But this is an unsolved mystery, and unsolved mysteries attract theories the way a porch light attracts moths. Some are reasonable, some are questionable, and some, well, they require so many assumptions it would make a mathematician cry. Let's start with one of the more popular alternatives, the staged disappearance. According to this theory, Frederick didn't crash at all. He disappeared on purpose. Supporters point to a few key details. Frederick was incredibly fascinated by UFOs, and he reportedly talked about them before his final flight. And unlike most missing aircraft cases, there has never been any confirmed wreckage found. So, what if the entire radio exchange was staged? What if Frederick used the UFO story as a cover and then just simply vanished? It is quite an interesting theory, right up until you start asking difficult questions like how, where, with whose help, because pulling off a fake disappearance in a small aircraft is not exactly easy. You would need a second landing site, a plan, resources, secrecy, and most importantly, a way to stay hidden for the next 50 years. But we don't have a single verified sighting of this guy. There's been no documentation of him. Not one single person has come forward saying that they saw him. I gotta say, that is a pretty impressive retirement plan, especially for a 20-year-old flying a small Cessna. Then there's the military theory, because it's always the government, right? This one suggests that Frederick may have encountered some type of experimental aircraft. After all, the 1970s were the Cold War. Governments were testing new technology right, left, and center. Military projects were often incredibly secretive. And history has shown that strange aircraft have occasionally been mistaken for UFOs. The problem? Well, there's no evidence that has ever surfaced linking Frederick's disappearance to any type of military operation. No documents, no witnesses, no declassified reports, just nothing. Now, it doesn't make that theory impossible by any means. It means we're operating in the realm of speculation rather than evidence. And then there's perhaps the most intriguing theory of all, the one that sits somewhere between the UFO explanation and the pilot error explanation. What if Frederick saw something real, but misunderstood what it was? See, this theory does not require aliens, and it does not require a government cover-up, and it certainly does not require Frederick to be hallucinating. Maybe there really was a light. Maybe there really was another aircraft. Maybe there really was something unusual in the sky that night. But in the darkness, over open water, with limited visual references, Frederick just interpreted what he saw incorrectly. A real object, a real observation with a mistaken conclusion. And honestly, I think that might be the most human explanation out of all of them, because that's just what people do. We take incomplete information and build a story around it. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But the less information we have, the more creative those stories tend to become, which brings us to the biggest problem in the entire Frederick case. No matter which theory you choose, eventually you will hit the same wall, that missing airplane. The UFO theory can't prove what the object was. The pilot error theory can't produce the wreckage. The military theory has no evidence. The staged disappearance theory requires a level of planning that really kind of borders on science fiction. Every road leads to a dead end, a young pilot who vanished over the Bass Strait. And the one thing that everyone needs in order to settle this debate, the aircraft itself, has never been found, which means after nearly 50 years, the most honest answer might also be the least satisfying. And here we are, the question that has been hanging over this entire case since 1978. What happened to Frederick Valentich? The honest answer? I have no idea. And anyone who tells you that they know exactly what happened to him is probably trying to sell you a book, a documentary, or a timeshare on the dark side of the moon. Because nearly 50 years later, we still don't have the one thing that investigators desperately need. Evidence. Not theories, not speculation, not somebody's uncle who swears he saw a UFO while 3 beers deep at a barbecue in 1987. Evidence. And that's what makes the case so frustrating. The UFO theory has some genuinely intriguing details. Frederick's radio transmissions are incredibly real. His concern is genuine. The object he described is certainly behaving strangely. And the complete disappearance of both a pilot and an entire aircraft has kept that theory alive for decades. But here's the problem. The UFO theory asks us to make a pretty big leap. It asks us to believe that Frederick encountered something extraordinary. And while that is in fact possible, there simply isn't enough evidence to prove it. And then we have the explanation favored by most aviation investigators: spatial disorientation, pilot error, a gradual loss of spatial awareness over dark water. It is not exciting. Nobody is making blockbuster movies called The Slightly Misleading Horizon, but it fits a surprising number of facts. Frederick was relatively inexperienced. He was flying alone at night over open water in conditions known to create visual illusions. And aviation history is filled with accidents that initially sounded impossible until investigators pieced together what actually happened. If I were forced to place a bet, that's probably where I would put my money. Not because it's exciting or anything like that, because it's the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions. But here's where things get interesting. Even if Frederick became disoriented, that doesn't necessarily mean that he imagined everything. Maybe he saw a star. Maybe he saw Venus. Maybe he saw another aircraft. Maybe he saw something that none of us can identify. Those possibilities are not mutually exclusive. The mistake might not have been seeing something. The mistake might have been interpreting what he was seeing. And that is a very important distinction, because one of the biggest misconceptions about this case is that only one thing can be true. Maybe Frederick saw a real light. Maybe he became disoriented while trying to track it. Maybe both things happened at the same time. And suddenly the mystery becomes a lot more complicated. As for me, well, I don't think this case proves aliens. I don't think it proves government cover-up. And trust me, I love a good government cover-up story, okay? And I definitely don't think that it proves that extraterrestrials traveled millions of light years to harass a guy flying a Cessna over Australia. That would be a very strange use of advanced technology. What I do think is that something happened out there that night. Something convinced Frederick that he was looking at an object he couldn't identify. Whether that object was extraordinary or completely ordinary may be something we never know, because the one witness who could answer that question disappeared with the airplane. And that's why the Frederick Valentich case refuses to die. Not because we have too many answers, but because we don't have enough. Nearly 50 years later, we're still listening to the same radio transmissions, still debating the same theories, still staring at the darkness over the Bass Strait looking for an explanation. Maybe that's the real mystery. Not what Frederick saw, but why, after all this time, we still can't stop wondering. So, what do you think? Did Frederick encounter a UFO? Did he become disoriented? Did he see something completely ordinary and just misinterpret it? Or is there another explanation that we've just missed entirely? Let me know down below in the comments. I love to read all of your thoughts, your comments, and your theories, so keep them coming. If you enjoyed today's investigation, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, and join me here on the Ninth File, because every subscription helps the channel grow. And if you're still not subscribed, just remember, Frederick Valentich disappeared without a trace. My subscriber count, however, does not have to do that. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep asking questions, stay curious, and remember, the truth may be out there, but so are a lot of people who think every light bulb is an alien spacecraft. I'll see you in the next file.